On the morning of my wedding, my fiancé walked past me blindfolded and took my best friend's hand. When he pulled off the blindfold and realized the woman in front of him was not me, he did not let go right away. Instead, he smiled and said, "There is no way I wouldn't recognize her." The laughter in the bridal suite died so quickly that I could hear the soft mechanical click of the photographer's camera. A few hours later, I canceled the wedding. But I did not leave because Daniel Carter failed a silly bridal party challenge. I left because that challenge finally forced me to see what had been happening in front of me for months. The man I was supposed to marry and the woman I had trusted for 12 years had been having an affair. Worse, they still wanted the ceremony to go forward. Daniel wanted access to my clients, my professional reputation, and the financial stability he had spent years pretending not to need. Chloe was willing to wait until he had taken everything useful from our marriage before stepping into my place. They believed that once I was wearing the dress, once 100 guests were seated and the deposits were gone, I would be too embarrassed to walk away. They were wrong. That day, I did not become the bride who had been abandoned. I simply stopped walking toward a man who had never truly chosen me. What neither of them knew was that years later, when they each stood in the doorway of the flower shop where I had rebuilt my life, I would no longer need their regret. Daniel and I had planned to marry at a vineyard resort in Napa Valley. We had been together for 6 years and engaged for 1. For nearly 10 months, I had managed the room block, the catering, the seating chart, the transportation schedule, the rentals, and every vendor detail in between. Daniel always said work was too demanding for him to get involved in the small things. The small things apparently included the invitation suite, the rehearsal dinner, the ceremony music, and whether his 80-year-old aunt needed a ground floor room. I told myself it was fine. Event planning had been my career for years. I knew how to read a contract, negotiate with a caterer, and keep 3 vendors from blaming one another when a delivery arrived late. It was easier to do things myself than to ask Daniel 5 times and listen to him complain that I was micromanaging. My maid of honor, Chloe Bennett, helped whenever she could. Chloe and I had met our sophomore year of college. We had lived in a cramped apartment with unreliable heat, split boxes of pasta when money was tight, and stayed up until dawn studying at a kitchen table that wobbled whenever either of us leaned on it. When we were 22, we promised we would stand beside each other on our wedding days no matter where life took us. After my mother died, Chloe was the person who slept on my couch for 3 weeks because I could not stand the silence in my apartment. She handled phone calls when I could not speak. She brought groceries I forgot to eat. She knew which stories about my mother would make me laugh instead of cry. I believed that even if everyone else eventually left, Chloe would not. The rehearsal dinner took place the evening before the wedding on a stone terrace overlooking the vines. Both families were there, along with the wedding party and the guests who had flown in early. String lights hung above the tables, the air smelled faintly of rosemary and warm bread, and everyone seemed relieved that the months of planning were almost over. Halfway through dinner, my cousin Lily and the MC announced a quick couples game. They handed Daniel and me small whiteboards and asked us to write our answers separately. Chloe had not prepared the questions. She only passed out the boards and markers before stepping beside the MC. The first question was simple. What is Emma's favorite flower? I wrote white peonies. They had been my mother's favorite. Every year on her birthday, I bought a bunch and placed them in the blue glass vase she had kept in our kitchen when I was growing up. Daniel knew that. At least, I had always believed he did. We lifted our boards at the same time. Mine said white peonies. Daniel's said yellow tulips. The table erupted in the kind of forgiving laughter people use when a groom gets a question wrong at his own rehearsal dinner. Daniel shrugged. Wedding nerves. Beside the MC, Chloe's smile froze for the smallest fraction of a second. Yellow tulips were her favorite flowers. Then she lifted her wine glass and said lightly, "Well, at least somebody remembers mine." Everyone laughed again. I managed to smile because one wrong answer did not mean anything. The second question was, what food can Emma not eat? I wrote almonds. Daniel wrote shellfish. Chloe was allergic to shellfish. The laughter was quieter that time. The MC tried to rescue the mood. Looks like the groom has some studying to do tonight. Daniel looked at me, already annoyed. Emma eats almost everything. I can't be expected to remember every ingredient. I said nothing. 2 months earlier, a waiter had nearly served me a dessert made with almond flour. Chloe had caught the mistake. Daniel had been sitting beside me when it happened. The third question was, what nickname does Daniel use for Emma in his phone? I hesitated before writing M. He had called me that since our first date. Daniel barely paused. He wrote one word in large letters. Sunshine. My fingers went still around the marker. Daniel had never called me Sunshine. Sunshine had been Chloe's nickname since college. Her social media bio still read, chasing sunshine wherever I go. For one full second, the color drained from her face. Then she picked up her wine glass and pretended nothing had happened. Daniel flipped his board face down. The last 2 questions got in my head. It is just a game. Nobody needs to make it weird. He said it while looking at me, as if I were already at fault for the discomfort in the room. The MC moved on quickly. Guests began talking over one another. Everyone wanted the moment to disappear. But across the terrace, Daniel and Chloe exchanged a glance. It was not the confused look of 2 people surprised by a coincidence. It was the quick, silent check of 2 people wondering whether a shared secret had just become visible. Back in our suite that night, I asked Daniel why every answer he gave belonged to Chloe. He loosened his tie and sighed. Emma, it was 3 questions. And you got all 3 wrong. 2 happened to match Chloe. What about Sunshine? Why did you write her nickname as mine? His hands paused at his collar. Because she says it constantly. Everyone knows that nickname. Then what do you know about me? We have been together for 6 years, and you do not remember what could put me in the hospital. The familiar irritation appeared on his face. Are you really starting a fight over a party game the night before our wedding? He had used some version of that question for years. Whenever I raised a concern, he turned the concern into a flaw in my personality. I was too sensitive. I expected too much. I chose the worst possible moment. I made everything stressful. Eventually, I would apologize because restoring peace always seemed more urgent than proving I had a right to be upset. Only later did I understand that Daniel had not failed to see my value. He had come to depend on it. He relied on the way I organized our life, remembered the details, managed the bills, and opened professional doors he could not open himself. The more he needed me, the more he seemed compelled to diminish me, as if making me smaller proved he was still the one in control. That night, I did not apologize. I only want to know what is happening, I said. Nothing is happening. More than 100 people are waiting for us tomorrow. Do not let your anxiety ruin this. He took his phone onto the balcony. Through the glass, I watched the screen light up several times. He typed a reply and smiled. I told myself I could not destroy 6 years over a rehearsal dinner game. Still, I barely slept. At 7 the next morning, the bridesmaids arrived at my suite. Hair and makeup artists filled the room with curling irons, cosmetic cases, coffee cups, and garment bags. The photographer moved quietly between us, capturing the kind of candid footage that looks effortless only because someone planned every second of it. Chloe came in carrying a cardboard tray of coffees, as if nothing had happened. Big day, she said, wrapping her arms around me. I smelled orange blossom perfume on her skin. Before the rehearsal dinner, I had never paid attention to the fragrance. That morning it seemed to fill the entire room. Around 9, the groomsmen brought Daniel to the hallway outside the suite. My cousin Lily and the photography team had included 2 short Find the Bride challenges on the content list weeks earlier. They were the sort of light-hearted clips couples posted online after the wedding. Chloe had not known the details in advance. She and 3 other bridesmaids were called over when filming began. For the first challenge, Daniel was blindfolded and asked to identify me by touching each woman's hand for only a few seconds. The photographer reminded him not to peek. Daniel moved past the first bridesmaid. I was second. His fingers rested against mine briefly, then let go. When he reached Chloe, he stopped. His fingers moved from her palm to the inside of her wrist. His thumb settled directly over a tiny mole there, as though he knew exactly where to find it. Then he closed his hand around hers. Chloe squeezed back before catching herself. The movement was too natural to be a guess. It looked like the reflex of two bodies that had learned each other in private. Daniel removed the blindfold. For an instant, his expression locked when he saw Chloe in front of him. Then he laughed. That was impossible. A few people laughed with him. I did not. The photographer noticed the shift in the room and skipped the other physical shots. She moved straight to the voice challenge that had already been recorded. Each bridesmaid and I had said the same sentence, "I'm right here." Daniel listened to 4 clips. He selected the third almost immediately. It was Chloe. He took off the blindfold, saw her standing in front of him, and smiled. There is no way I wouldn't recognize her. The room went silent. Daniel's face changed as he heard his own words. "I meant Emma," he said quickly. The photographer lowered her camera. But that wasn't Emma. Every face turned toward me. I sat at the vanity with my veil already pinned into my hair. In the mirror, I looked polished and composed. I also looked like a stranger watching someone else's wedding fall apart. Strangely, the anger left me. My mind became very quiet. Details I had dismissed over the previous months began returning one by one. Daniel's sudden increase in business trips. Chloe knowing his schedule before I did. The two of them using the same unusual phrases at dinner. Chloe commenting on the new bedside lamps in our bedroom, then insisting I must have mentioned them. One was the man I planned to spend my life with. The other was the woman I had trusted for 12 years. It had never occurred to me that I needed to protect myself from both of them. I did not confront them immediately. Without proof, Daniel would say wedding stress had made me irrational. Chloe would cry and say I had misunderstood. Relatives would urge me not to throw away a marriage over a party game. I needed the truth before everyone else began telling me which version of it would be easiest to live with. Chloe had been coordinating the wedding day schedule with the vendors. The night before, she had signed into her messaging account on the wedding tablet so she could receive updates from the florist, transportation company, and venue staff. Notification previews were still enabled. The tablet belonged to me. We used it for the timeline, seating chart, vendor contacts, and music cues. Chloe left it on the vanity when she went downstairs, claiming she needed to check the ceremony flowers. I did not open her messages. Instead, I logged into the wedding email account. The resort's final folio had arrived that morning. I reviewed the room block, catering charges, and event spaces until I found an additional accommodation charge from 2 months earlier. At the time, Daniel had told me he needed to visit Napa alone to review venue details and sign vendor documents. He had added a king room to our wedding master account using the group booking code. I had assumed it was part of that trip. The final folio listed a second registered guest, Chloe Bennett. I remembered the date immediately. Daniel had said he was handling paperwork in Napa. Chloe had told me she was meeting a brand client in Los Angeles. That night, I had texted both of them. Daniel replied, busy. Chloe sent me a photograph of hotel breakfast and complained that business travel was lonely. The picture showed 1 coffee cup. I had told her that after the wedding, the two of us should finally take another girls' trip. My hands were cold as I forwarded the folio to my personal email. Then a message preview appeared at the top of the tablet. It was from Daniel. Is she starting to suspect something? Almost immediately, Chloe's reply appeared. You promised that after she introduces you to the hotel group and the project closes, you will end the marriage. Stop making mistakes. I understood then that Chloe had not gone downstairs to check the flowers. She was confronting Daniel about losing control during the games. Their argument continued in real time, and the notification previews kept appearing. Only a few more hours, Daniel wrote. Once she gets me in front of the development committee, I won't have to keep pretending. Then another message. I lost focus last night and this morning because all I could think about was you. I did not need to read anything else. For years, I had worked as an independent event strategist and maintained relationships with several luxury hotel and resort companies. Daniel had repeatedly asked me to introduce his real estate firm to one hospitality group that was exploring a new resort development. I had refused. His company had not completed the environmental and financial reviews that would make an introduction responsible. Daniel accused me of not supporting him. He depended on my connections, but he hated being reminded that he needed them. Every time I refused to put my reputation behind a deal I did not trust, he treated my caution as betrayal. Now I understood why he had insisted on going through with the wedding even while sleeping with Chloe. He did not want to lose me. He wanted to keep access to my professional network, my credibility, and the steady life I had built around him. Chloe was not waiting for him to choose between us. She was waiting for him to use me first. They believed that after the ceremony, after the money and public promises and family expectations, I would tolerate what I never would have accepted the day before. I photographed the notification previews and contacted the resort's event manager. When she arrived, I confirmed the facts that mattered. I was the primary signer on the wedding contracts. Most charges were tied to my accounts. The marriage license had not been signed. I could stop the ceremony and remove Daniel's authorization from the wedding master account. I did not cancel the guest rooms or the meal that had already been prepared. The people who had traveled to Napa had done nothing wrong. The event manager looked from my wedding dress to the folio in my hand. Are you sure? I met my reflection in the mirror. Yes. It was the most certain word I had spoken all day. At 4 that afternoon, the guests were seated on the lawn beside the vineyard. Daniel waited beneath the floral arch in a dark suit with a white Lysianthus boutonniere I had chosen myself. From a distance, he still looked like the groom I had imagined for years. The strings began to play. Everyone turned toward the aisle. I stepped outside in my wedding dress without my bouquet and without my father's arm linked through mine. Dad stood beside the entrance. Are you sure you want to walk out there alone? He asked quietly. I nodded. This time, I need to do it myself. He did not argue. He only squeezed my hand. I did not walk toward Daniel. I stopped in front of the guests. Before the ceremony begins, I need to show you something. A murmur moved across the lawn. Daniel came toward me quickly. Emma, don't do this. Why? This is not the time to discuss it. You're right. I nodded. I am not going to discuss it in private. The screen beside the reception tent came on. The video showed Daniel walking past me blindfolded and taking Chloe's hand. Then everyone heard him say, there is no way I wouldn't recognize her. The clip ended. Chloe rose from the bridesmaids' row, her face drained of color. Emma, it was only a game. The event staff displayed the hotel charge attached to our wedding account. Then came the screenshots of the notification previews. The guests went completely still. Daniel rushed toward me. You read our private messages? Even then, his first concern was how I had found out, not what he had done. They appeared on the wedding tablet, I said. And the hotel folio was charged to my account. He lowered his voice. We can deal with this privately. You have been dealing with it privately for a long time. Now I am ending it publicly. Chloe began to cry. I never meant to hurt you. I finally looked at her. You adjusted my veil at the dress fitting. You held my hand while we chose the flowers and told me my mother would have loved them. Every time I worried about marriage, you told me Daniel was a good man. Her mouth trembled. You knew exactly how to hurt me. You just believed that if I found out late enough, I would be too afraid to leave. She had no answer. I took the bouquet from one of the bridesmaids and placed it on the empty chair in front of Chloe. From last night until this morning, every time he was asked to choose, he chose you. Then I turned to Daniel. But you do not truly want to marry her either. You want the excitement she gives you and the stability, clients, reputation, and financial credibility I provide. You were never unable to choose between two women. You simply believed you were entitled to use both. Daniel's father lowered his eyes. My father stood from his seat. Daniel grabbed my arm. You will regret this the minute you walk away. Dad took one step forward, but I shook my head. I wanted to finish this without anyone rescuing me. I looked down at Daniel's hand until he slowly let go. The wedding is canceled, I said to the guests. Dinner will still be served, and the rooms already reserved will remain available. You came a long way, and you should not have to pay for their choices. But there will be no marriage today. I removed my engagement ring and set it on the welcome table. Daniel stared at me. You're running away from your own wedding. No. I am ending a fraud before it becomes a marriage. I turned and walked away from the vineyard. No one applauded. There was no dramatic cheering. Only wind moving through the vines and the sound of my dress brushing the stone path. My father followed without hurrying me or demanding to know what I planned to do next. At the hotel entrance, he placed his jacket around my shoulders. "Let's go home," he said. I looked toward the road beyond the property. "I don't know where home is anymore." He was quiet for a moment. "Then take your time finding it." The next 2 months were the most disorienting of my life. Mutual friends sent messages constantly. Some supported me. Others thought exposing Daniel and Chloe in front of the guests had been cruel. A few said Daniel was devastated. Others said Chloe had stopped leaving her apartment because she could not face the social fallout. Several people urged me to hear their explanations, as though the right explanation might turn betrayal into an administrative misunderstanding. I muted most of them. It was not because I felt nothing. It was because every mention of Daniel or Chloe returned me to the vineyard. My father offered to let me stay with him. I declined, but I accepted his help. He came with me to clear out the apartment Daniel and I had rented in San Francisco. The dining table had been one of our first purchases after the engagement. The cushion on Daniel's end of the sofa still held the shape of his body. I donated almost everything I could. On moving day, Dad placed my mother's old flower shears and blue glass vase in the back seat of my car. "These belong with you," he said. I left San Francisco with a car, several boxes of clothes, my laptop, and the things my mother had left behind. I chose Portland, Oregon. Not because it offered some grand opportunity. I had visited once and remembered independent bookstores, neighborhood coffee shops, weekend markets, old houses, long rainy afternoons, and people waiting in ordinary coats for bread from small bakeries. Most importantly, no one there knew me. No one knew I had walked away from a wedding in a white dress. I rented a one-bedroom apartment in an aging building. The windows were small. The kitchen cabinets had been painted too many times. The upstairs neighbor crossed the floor every morning at 6. On my first night, I ate takeout on the floor because I had not unpacked a chair. There were no Daniel's shoes by the door, no keys thrown across the counter, and no one asking whether I had figured out dinner. I expected freedom. What arrived instead was a vast, echoing emptiness. I sat among the boxes until I finally folded over my knees and cried. I was not crying because the wedding had not happened. I was crying because I could finally admit how much of myself I had surrendered to keep the relationship intact. I had left a full-time job I loved because Daniel said my travel schedule made it difficult for us to build a life. I had reduced my time with friends. I had arranged my plans around his career. Whenever we argued, my first question had always been, what can I do to make this easier for him? I rarely asked whether it was fair to me. The next morning, Dad called. He did not ask whether I had cried or when I planned to come back. He only said, "Eat some breakfast." After that, he called every Sunday. Sometimes we spoke for 10 minutes. He told me about the weather in San Francisco. I told him about the rain in Portland. He never forced me to talk about the wedding. His refusal to push became the kindest support he could have given me. I continued taking remote event planning projects to cover my rent and expenses. At the end of each workday, I walked through the neighborhood. That was how I found the flower shop. It sat between a used bookstore and a narrow storefront that had changed businesses several times. The sign above the window was faded. Buckets of seasonal flowers stood inside, beside a handwritten card that read, "Closing at the end of the month. Owner retiring." The bell made a soft sound when I entered. A woman in her late 60s sat behind the counter. Her name was Margaret Ellis. She had owned the shop for 31 years. Her husband had died 7 years earlier, and she had kept it going alone. Now her daughter wanted her to move to Seattle. "Are you looking for flowers?" she asked. I meant to say yes. Instead, I asked, "Are you really closing?" She studied me for a few seconds. "Unless someone wants to take it over." I had spent years planning weddings and luxury events. I understood color, sourcing, installation, and how flowers changed a room. I had never managed a retail shop. I did not offer to buy it. For the next 2 months, though, I went back almost every week. Sometimes I bought a small bunch of flowers. Sometimes I stayed and talked with Margaret. A week before Christmas, one of her employees called in sick on the same day the shop received a large funeral order. I stayed to help. We worked for more than 12 hours. After midnight, I sat on the stockroom floor trimming stems. My fingers were pricked, my back hurt, and leaves were caught in my hair. It was the first full day since the wedding when I had not thought about Daniel. After the order was delivered, Margaret asked, "Have you seriously considered taking over?" This time, I did not dismiss the idea. Over the next several weeks, I reviewed the lease, supplier agreements, inventory, and 3 years of sales records. I hired a local accountant to look through the books. The shop was not buried in debt, but foot traffic had declined. The website had not been updated in years. Online orders were almost non-existent. I could not afford to purchase all the equipment and goodwill at once. Margaret offered a seller-financed arrangement. I would assume the lease and buy the inventory up front, then pay the remaining transfer price over 2 years. I kept part of my remote planning work so I would not lose every source of income while the shop found its footing. When I explained the plan to my father, he was quiet for a long time. "Are you sure you are not running into a new life because the old one hurt?" It was the first time he had asked me directly. "I'm not sure," I admitted. "But when I work there, I do not feel like I am running." He did not try to stop me. On the day the transfer became official, a package arrived from San Francisco. Inside were my mother's flower shears and a note in my father's handwriting. "For your second beginning." I named the shop at 2 in the morning. Second bloom. Starting over was not romantic. During the first week, almost no one came in. I drove to the wholesale flower market before dawn, processed stems, scrubbed buckets, built arrangements, updated the website, swept the floor, and reconciled the books by myself. Some days I sold only 3 bouquets. At the end of the first week, I realized I had thrown away more flowers than I had sold. I sat behind the counter looking at the waste numbers and wondered whether I had made another terrible decision. Margaret stopped by to collect an old photo album from the stockroom. She looked into the compost bin and frowned. "You bought too much." I was afraid customers would come in and not have enough choices. When customers are not coming in, more choices only mean more waste. She took off her coat and helped me reorganize the cooler. "A flower shop is not an event," she said. "At a wedding, everything has to be perfect for one day. A neighborhood shop has to give people a reason to come back every week." "How do I do that?" She pointed through the front window. "Start by knowing your neighbors." The next morning, I carried several unsold but still fresh bouquets to the coffee shop, bookstore, and bakery nearby. I did not make a sales pitch. I introduced myself. Marcus, who owned the coffee shop, offered to display small wrapped bouquets near his register and split the revenue when they sold. The bookstore agreed to host weekend floral workshops. The bakery needed new table flowers every week. None of those arrangements was large, but together they gave the shop predictable cash flow. I launched a monthly bouquet subscription. The first group had 7 customers. I wrote down every preference. One person hated lilies. Another was sensitive to strong fragrance. One man bought flowers each month to mark the date his wife had died. As I learned their names, they learned mine. 3 months after opening, a young woman came in to ask whether I could design the flowers for her wedding. She opened a folder of inspiration photographs. My hand stopped on the page. White peonies. The same flower I had planned for my own wedding. "Can you take the job?" she asked. I wanted to say no. That night, I dreamed I was standing at the vineyard again. Daniel waited beneath the arch. Chloe held my bouquet. Everyone watched as if I were the one who had ruined the day. I woke at 3 in the morning and opened the photographs on my laptop. Then I understood that white peonies did not belong to Daniel or to the wedding I had canceled. They belonged to my mother. They belonged to the blue vase on our childhood windowsill. They belonged to memories that had never hurt me. If I rejected every flower, song, or place connected to the wedding, I would be giving Daniel and Chloe ownership of everything I had once loved. The next morning, I accepted the order. The week of the wedding, part of the flower shipment was delayed. The day before the ceremony, the shop's cooler failed. I did not have time to collapse. I found replacement blooms from 2 local growers, borrowed refrigerated space from a nearby restaurant, and worked with the bride to adjust several table arrangements without changing the overall look. On the wedding morning, I arrived before 5. My hands shook slightly as I placed the final peony in the bridal bouquet. When the bride saw it, Her face lit up. This is exactly what I wanted. During the ceremony, I stood outside the greenhouse packing tools. The bride walked down the aisle on her father's arm toward a man who looked at her as though the room contained no one else. I did not break down. I did not envy her. I understood that someone else's happiness did not prove my failure. My wedding had not happened, but my life had not ended there. 6 months after Second Bloom opened, a mutual friend sent me a photograph of Daniel and Chloe. They had married in a small civil ceremony at San Francisco City Hall. Chloe wore a short white dress and carried yellow tulips. Daniel stood beside her with one hand at her waist. The caption read, "Some love stories are only delayed." I stared at the sentence for a long time. They had rewritten betrayal as destiny, as though getting married afterward transformed every lie into an act of courage. That night, I opened Chloe's profile for the first time since leaving California. She had posted her ring, their new apartment, weekend trips, and photographs of breakfast Daniel had supposedly made for her. Every image looked aimed at an invisible audience she needed to convince. I watched for 10 minutes. Then I closed the page and unfollowed both of them. It was not punishment. I was simply done allowing their posts to determine the mood of my day. After that, I heard only fragments through mutual friends. Daniel's company was struggling to move several projects forward. Chloe posted less often. The polished couple photographs continued, but the spaces between them grew longer. I did not ask for details. My own life had become specific. The week before Valentine's Day, my part-time employee and I worked until midnight. In spring, we held our first floral class at the bookstore. In summer, a storm canceled a neighborhood market, so I turned the flowers I had purchased into subscription-sized arrangements and delivered them to offices and restaurants around the area. The shop slowly stabilized. Then, just as I began to believe the worst financial period was behind me, my landlord notified me that the rent would increase by 35% when the lease renewed. I stared at the proposal all night. Second Bloom had only just reached consistent profitability. If I accepted the new rent without changing anything, a year of progress could disappear. Margaret suggested moving to a cheaper location outside the neighborhood. But leaving would mean abandoning the community relationships that had kept the shop alive. For the first time, I had to decide whether to preserve a traditional shop that could barely survive or change what the business was. I recalculated every service. I reduced large installations that required too much labor for too little margin. I expanded corporate subscriptions, small ceremonies, memorial work, and classes. The bookstore rented me its unused back room for weekend workshops. Marcus's coffee shop provided drinks and shared the workshop revenue, which meant I did not have to open a food service operation of my own. I also arranged a weekly flower program with a nearby hospital for families of long-term patients. Within 3 months, subscriptions and classes covered the added costs. I offered the landlord a longer lease in exchange for a smaller increase, and we reached terms I could sustain. The night the agreement was signed, I locked the shop and stood in the rain with the key in my hand. I realized I had not thought about Daniel in weeks. There was no music and no dramatic revelation. Portland simply no longer felt like the city I had escaped to. It felt like home. A year after Daniel and Chloe married, Second Bloom had 2 steady part-time employees, and I was planning a small studio space for classes. That was when Chloe emailed me. The subject line contained 2 words. "I'm sorry." The message was long. She said she was pregnant. She also admitted that the marriage she displayed online did not resemble the life they lived at home. Daniel's firm was under financial pressure. He had begun comparing her to me constantly. Emma knew how to plan a budget. Emma never created problems when he was busy. If Emma were still here, she would have found a way to get him into that hotel project. Chloe wrote, "I thought he talked about you because he still loved you. Now I understand that he misses having someone carry his life for him." She admitted that love had not been the only reason she betrayed me. Jealousy had mattered just as much. She had envied my work, my relationship with my mother, and the fact that Daniel had chosen to marry me publicly. When he showed interest in her, she felt that she had finally beaten me at something. Near the end of the email, she wrote, "I did not only lose you. I lost the version of myself who had not done this yet." I read the message and did not reply. I believed she regretted what she had done. Regret did not automatically restore trust. 2 weeks later, she appeared outside the flower shop. She wore a loose coat, and her pregnancy was clearly visible. Rain streaked the window between us. For several minutes, she stood on the sidewalk as though she could not decide whether she had the right to come inside. Finally, she opened the door. The bell rang softly. We had not seen each other in almost 2 years. She looked thinner except for the curve of her stomach. There were dark shadows beneath her eyes. Emma. I did not welcome her, but I did not tell her to leave. I poured her a glass of water and asked her to sit near the window. She looked around the shop. It is beautiful. Thank you. Did you do all of this by yourself? No, I said. A lot of people helped me. She lowered her eyes. Then she began apologizing. At first, the apologies still contained explanations. She and Daniel had started by talking. She had not expected it to become physical. She had wanted to tell me before the wedding, but had never found the courage. I listened until she said, "I never wanted it to turn into this. But each time you crossed another line, you knew what you were doing." She began to cry. I know. This time, she did not argue. She said she missed our friendship. She missed our college apartment. She missed the 3 weeks after my mother died when I had stayed at her place because I could not bear to be alone. Her hand rested on her stomach. When the baby is born, I thought maybe you could be her godmother. I looked at her for a long moment. Why would you think I would want that? Because we were so close once. You do not only want forgiveness. You want me to become the person who catches you again, who carries whatever you cannot bear. Tears slid down her face. The reason you were able to hurt me so deeply is that we were close. You knew exactly where the vulnerable parts were. She looked down. I accept that you are admitting what you did, I said. I do not want anything bad to happen to you or your baby. But accepting an apology does not mean bringing you back into my life. Our friendship is not something you can break and then place back on the shelf because you finally said you were sorry. There is no chance at all? I remembered the college girl who had gone out in the middle of the night to buy medicine when I had a fever. I also remembered the woman who adjusted my veil while waiting for messages from my fiancé. Both women were Chloe. I could not preserve one and pretend the other had never existed. No, I said. Before she left, I wrapped a small bunch of white daisies for her. She looked at the flowers as though they meant forgiveness. There, goodbye, I said. She carried them into the rain. I watched from behind the window until she disappeared at the corner. I did not feel victorious. I felt sad. Sometimes not hating a person anymore does not mean they are safe to let close again. Several months later, a mutual friend told me Chloe had been rushed to the hospital with severe pregnancy complications. Doctors had to deliver the baby far too early. The baby did not survive. I was wrapping a birthday bouquet when I received the call. The scissors stopped in my hand. That child was innocent. Whatever Chloe had done, this was not a punishment she deserved. I did not contact her directly. Not because I felt nothing, but because appearing during the most vulnerable moment of her life might suggest that the boundary between us had changed. I asked our mutual friend to tell her that I was deeply sorry and hoped she would take care of herself. 3 months later, a handwritten letter arrived. Chloe did not ask me to forgive her. She wrote that after the baby died, every unresolved problem in her marriage had surfaced at once. She needed Daniel to grieve with her. He buried himself in work. Every conversation about the baby ended in blame. During their worst argument, Daniel said, "If I had never left Emma, my life would not look like this." Chloe wrote, "That was when I finally understood that no matter who he was with, he would never take responsibility for his own choices. He blamed me for his stalled career, for losing the life you created, and even for the fact that he did not know how to face grief." Then she added, "But I cannot put all of it on him. I chose to hurt you. I chose to marry a man who had already proven he could betray his partner." She said they were separated and preparing to divorce. She planned to leave social media, return to the city where her parents lived, and begin therapy. The final lines read, "You do not need to answer. This time, I only wanted to tell the truth. I am not using an apology to ask for anything back. I placed the letter in a drawer. That evening, I arranged white daisies in the front window. They were not for Chloe, and they were not a celebration of her marriage ending. They were for a child who had never been given the chance to grow up. The loss also made me think seriously about what a flower shop could offer beyond beautiful things for sale. A few months later, I partnered with a local women's support organization to host a free floral workshop. Some participants were divorced. Some had lost partners. Others had spent years caring for parents, spouses, or children and were only beginning to recognize themselves again. I did not tell them my story. I sat beside them, trimmed damaged stems, changed the water, and showed them how to make space for what could still open. Daniel came to Portland when Second Bloom had been open for 2.5 years. A weekend class was underway. I was showing several customers how to condition roses when the bell over the door rang. I looked up and saw him standing inside. He had lost weight. His suit was still expensive, but it sat badly on his shoulders. No one around us recognized him. In this city, he was not my fiancé or the groom from a ruined wedding. He was simply a stranger who did not belong in the room. After the class ended, I sent my employees home. Daniel sat near the window and looked around. "You really opened a flower shop," he said. "I did. It seems successful. It is doing well." My calm seemed to unsettle him. In the past, the moment Daniel entered a room, I had automatically begun monitoring his mood. Now I sat in my own shop and waited for him to state his purpose. "Chloe and I are divorced," he said at last. "I know. She contacted you? That is between Chloe and me." He was quiet. "Emma, I made a mistake." "Not one mistake." He lowered his head. "I know. I did not understand how good our life was until everything became unmanageable." "Was our life good?" "Of course it was. For you, maybe. Someone remembered your schedule, handled the bills, checked on your parents, connected you with clients, and apologized first whenever you were in a bad mood." I held his gaze. "For me, that relationship required becoming smaller and smaller so you could feel comfortable. I can change." "Why do you want to change now?" "Because I finally know who I really love." "Do you love me, or do you miss the life I used to organize for you?" He did not answer. "I already had one. I could stay in Portland," he said. "We could begin again. This is not a location problem. We had 6 years, Emma. And you spent part of them teaching me that my needs were inconveniences. You never used to be this cold." I almost smiled. "You're right. I used to place understanding everyone else above protecting myself. I do not want to be that woman again." Daniel stood. "So there is nothing I can do?" "You can change. You can learn to take responsibility. You can stop blaming other people for the consequences of your choices. You can become more honest." Hope appeared in his face. "But not to win me back," I continued. "Whatever life you build after you change will not include me." He stood there for a long time. Finally, he asked, "Do you honestly have no regrets?" I considered the question. "I regret not seeing the truth sooner. I regret giving up parts of myself to keep a relationship alive. But I have never regretted canceling the wedding." Daniel left while rain tapped the windows. He did not turn around. I did not walk him out. The bell rang once, and the shop became quiet again. I went back to the roses on the work table. My hands were steady. A year later, Second Bloom opened a second location. It was not a national company. I did not become famous, and I did not meet a richer man whose attention could prove I had one. I had 2 stable shops, a small team I trusted, and customers who returned each week because the place had become part of their lives. My father came to the opening. He stood in front of the window where my mother's blue glass vase held a bunch of white peonies. "She would have liked this," he said. I nodded. "I like it too." I continued partnering with the women's support organization and offered a free workshop every month. After one class, a woman in her 50s asked why I had named the shop Second Bloom. I looked toward the white peonies in the window. For a long time, I believed those flowers would only remind me of the wedding that never happened. Now they reminded me of my mother and of the life I had built from an empty apartment and a closing shop. "A lot of people believe they only get one chance to bloom," I said. "They choose a career when they are young, Marry someone, build a family, and think that if the choice turns out to be wrong, it is too late. But flowers do not work that way. You can cut away what is damaged, put them in clean water, and sometimes they open again. Will the second bloom look like the first? She asked. I shook my head. No. It is usually slower and it may not be perfect. But it belongs to you. After class, I turned off the lights. The street outside was dark with rain. Marcus waved through the window of the coffee shop. One of my employees reminded me that a wholesale delivery would arrive early the next morning. My father texted to ask whether I would be free for our Sunday call. It was all ordinary. I loved that it was ordinary. It was not the life Daniel had promised me, and it was not the life Chloe had tried to steal. It was the life I had built with my own hands. For years, I believed a woman's greatest happiness was being chosen without hesitation. Eventually, I understood that another person's choice could never determine my worth. On my wedding day, Daniel walked past me and took Chloe's hand. It took me years to make the final and most important choice of my life. I chose myself.